Hi, and welcome to our program. Today our guest is PhD from University, Sin Ulbjerg. We will talk about digital sexual abuse, its causes and consequences. Welcome, Sin. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start by defining this big concept that you wrote about in your PhD thesis. What is digital sexual abuse?
There are a lot of definitions to draw from, but the one that I'm using is that digital sexual abuse, it refers to the events happening around sharing, non-consensual sharing of intimate images. Mm-hmm. So it is when someone has an image shared that is somehow sexual or intimate to them, and it happens without their consent. And then it includes all the different kinds of harassment and other sorts of abuse that is linked to that image sharing as well.
Can it also be related to, text sharing, or is it mostly, the definition that you use at least, is mostly focused on images?
I worked mostly with image sharing, or at least there had to be some kind of image sharing, but very often if you have an image shared, you will receive a lot of abusive text messages as well. So these kind of acts, they overlap.
Mm-hmm. So it's very connected.
Very, yeah.
And you followed 5 girls for this 4 years, right, for your PhD. What examples can you give us of situations that they've been through? What type of digital sexual abuse did you work with?
So the 5 women I work with, they experienced quite different things. Mm-hmm. For some, it was the maybe common story, or the story that most people know, where they shared an image with someone they was dating, and he forwarded it to other people and sent it on. If some were sexually assaulted and someone filmed it, or raped even. Some had images stolen that were not actually sexual in the first place. One of them, for example, she had been taking images of herself in her underwear because she wanted to follow a weight loss, and then these images were shared and forwarded. And some had images that they shared themselves on social media. So one, for example, had bikini images shared, and then they were downloaded from Instagram and then put on an escort site to say that to pretend that she was selling herself. So it's very, very different stories.
Okay, okay, that sounds very And a lot of these things that you just said are very deeply connected with consent. But how can we define consent in a digital era?
So all the ways that I see digital sexual assault in the definition I just try to frame is based on consent. So it's not assault unless there is a breach of consent. And of course, there is a lot of discussions around how consent is in some ways harder to define in a digital era, because we have these norms about things that we share online where we don't necessarily need to ask consent, where if you take a picture with your friends, if you were to print that in a newspaper, everyone would assume that you would ask permission first, unless it was a big public area, right? But when you share it on social media, it's kind of accepted that you do that without necessarily asking permission, at least among people who are a little bit older. I think actually young people are getting a lot better at it. But of course, with sexual images, it's or intimate images, it is a little different, because you might say that you have some of the same ideas, especially if you receive a sexual image of someone else that you didn't share for the first time. Is it a breach of consent to send it to a new person, right, to express these images? There are some discussions around that, but generally, if you don't have consent to share an image, you shouldn't share an image. So ideally or legally, it isn't that complicated. But I understand how people sometimes can struggle to understand where the line goes when it comes to consent and sharing online.
Yeah, because for instance, if someone sends a more intimate picture to someone else, that someone else can maybe say that, but they sent it to me. Why can I not send it to other people, right? Is this sometimes the mentality that happens? Like, people don't really understand why this was wrong in the first place, or do they understand and they decide?
Mostly people who share an image the first time, who have received an intimate image privately and then shared on, they know that they're doing something wrong, or they know that at least what they're doing is risky, because you usually receive an image like that in a sphere of intimacy. Yeah. And when you break that sphere, of course, that's a breach of consent. And most people do know that. It's not always that, especially young people who share images that are already shared widely, they think about consent when sharing, because then they perceive it as something that's already out there. So it's already public, and then it's not, they don't think of it in terms of consent when resharing it. Or at least they didn't, but I think that is actually changing quite a lot, because there's been so much focus on these issues that now people are, especially young people, are starting to consider whether the images are shared consensually or not when they receive them.
So you think that this third part that was not involved maybe in this exchange of pictures in the first place has a lot of power here by saying that I'm not going to share this because I don't have direct consent. Like, I don't know where this came from. I don't know who this person is.
I think so, in a lot of ways, because it's the broad sharing of images that's really harmful, and also the uploading of images to sites where a lot of people can see them and download them. And that's the part of the assault that really makes it escalate and become extra traumatic and extensive for the victims. So definitely, people who reshare have a lot of power, and when you want to stop image sharing, it's also the best way to do it to have someone who's not directly involved in each community say no or talk against the sharing. Yeah,
it makes sense. And now I would like to talk a little bit more about the causes of this. So where is this coming from? Do different types of abuse have different types of causes? Like, is it all coming from the same place?
Well, there is a lot of it that's coming from a similar place as other kinds of gendered and sexual violence. And you can see that specifically because in most cases of digital sexual assault, the harassment that follows is extremely gendered and extremely sexistic. So you can see that this is coming from a place of misogyny, as many other kinds of gendered violence are. It does become a little more complicated when you're working with very young kids who maybe see sexual images and then share them, not because they're thinking about like any kind of sexist portrayal of the person in the image, but maybe because they're shocked about the content and need to share it to not sit alone with it. That's another kind of reaction, and that is different, I think, from other kinds of sexual violence. But generally, there is so much misogyny in the way that these images are shared and the way that victims are treated that it has a lot of similarities to other kinds of sexual violence. And it also, in most surveys, it seems at least, has a lot of the same consequences for victims' mental health.
And talking a little bit still about the causes, can the way that sexual education happens here in Denmark influence this, like for the good or for the bad? Can this be a cause, but maybe a tool for the future also?
I think sexual education and the focus on this topic has actually already influenced it a lot. I think a lot of the kids who have learned about whether it's digital sexual violence or just digital education in general, they are starting to realize that there might be consequences to the things that they share online, and they're starting to think about it more. So I think sex education already made a difference compared to 10 years ago, where my research is recent, but a lot of the girls I work with, they had the first image shared quite a long time, maybe between 5 and 10 years ago. So even compared to that time, I think things are shifting. But sex education, and especially within these kind of rather complicated topics, is not equally available to anyone. So there are some students, especially if you go to privileged schools in the cities, that will have a lot to say about consent and who have learned now to ask their friends about consent when they share an image on social media. And then there will be a lot of kids from less privileged areas and who don't have access to the kind of political and cultural environments where these things are often discussed, that have rarely even heard about these kind of cases.
Can the parents play a part here somehow?
Yes, of course. Yes, I think parents play a pretty big part that is maybe also often overlooked in some context, because a lot of parents struggle to understand their kids' digital lives and the importance of the life that children have online. And among the women I work with, it was also a recurring theme that their parents didn't really see why I was so serious, because they thought you can just close it down or you can just shut it off, or just don't use Facebook, right? But their life is so directed towards use of social media that, you find a job by using LinkedIn, you organize with your friends through Facebook, you socialize on different kinds of media. So for a young person today, it's almost impossible to not be on digital media in any way. And it's also hard to be on there anonymously because the media don't encourage it. And for example, if you want to use LinkedIn to find a job, it doesn't really make sense to have an anonymous profile, right? So they have a lot of practical challenges related to digital media, because if they are on social and digital media, they're afraid that the images will pop up there and people will find them and harass them. And that is a thing that they often experience that their parents wouldn't understand. So there is something important in parents to be more open towards understanding youth digital life and how central it is for social well-being and also just practical life in general.
Yeah, because sometimes we hear that digital abuse is a youth problem, right? What do you think about this? Do you agree with this?
Well, yes and no, because youth are the most vulnerable category. They experience it more often than adults do. But actually youth, and by that I mean teenagers and the years right before and after, are generally more vulnerable to sexual violence than people in any other age. So I don't know if it just mimics that or it has something directly to do with youth digital practices. So it's probably a little bit of both. So in some ways, it is a youth problem in the sense that youth are more often victimized. But in a broader sense, I wouldn't say it's specifically a youth problem. It happens to adult women as well, and there are also adults sharing and also making money on this kind of image sharing. So it is a much broader topic than just youth politics.
Yeah. And how can we change this mentality that this is the victim's fault?
Well, it's probably not everyone who thinks it's the victim's fault today, although that attitude is definitely still prominent in a lot of ways. The victim blaming that we see today in many ways is a lot more subtle. It is more in how the perpetrators are portrayed as these young boys who didn't know what they were doing, and now their lives will be ruined because they're being prosecuted. So we have this discourse around perpetrators that they are also victims and they are also mostly innocent, and that there might be some truth to that in some cases, but it also reflects very poorly back on the victim, because if the perpetrator is also a victim, then there's no real space left for the person who has actually had their intimate images exposed and their life turned upside down by harassment online.
Yeah. And how can this be handled?
Well, I think media has a lot of responsibility in that sense, because this focus on the perpetrator as these innocent, naive boys, that is very much perpetrated by the media. That's very much the focus that they choose to pursue.
Specifically the Danish media, or is this a worldwide situation?
Well, specifically the Danish media, because that's the one I've studied. I know there are some studies of Australian media that point to not exactly the same, but some similar ideas, that is in framing this as a youth problem. So you don't have perpetrators that can actually be held responsible because you just have children on both sides. And again, it's tricky because sometimes it is children on both sides, but you also got to remember that even kids know sometimes to be responsible for each other's well-being. And it's never just children. There also are adults who are supporting this circulation of images. There are pedophile networks that are using them, making money off of them. And there are adults behind all the big social media platforms that are choosing not to support the victims in these kind of cases. And there are adult journalists who are also choosing these kind of angles. So it's not just because of youth. It really is a lot of adults choosing how to frame and account for these images.
So the way to handle it really depends on if it's, as you said, like maybe children on both sides, or if there's an adult involved, right?
But there are always adults involved.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of stories want to put it as it's just children against children, but there always are adults who have neglected, for example, the care of the victim in these kind of cases.
Okay. And then what can we say about legislation? What role does it play here? Is there anything specific? Does it depend? Does it depend on if it's social media, if it's only online? What can you tell us about it?
Denmark actually has some new legislation now about digital sexual assault that also deals with these kind of sexualized digital threats. But generally, a lot of the cases that we've seen prosecuted, because they're from before this legislation, most of them are prosecuted as cases of sharing of child pornography or pornographic images with children, and that is a legal way to approach this issue that talks within some of the same frames as we just discussed in the media, that it assumes that this is young people and specifically people under 18. If you're an adult victim of digital sexual assault, or you don't even have to be adult, you just have to be older than 18, right? Then prosecution is a lot more tricky. And there are some who got compensation for damages and who got different kinds of justice in court procedures. But mostly we see this as a legal discussion that is focused on child pornography.
Yeah. So besides the legislation, is there anything that the actual social media is doing without the pressure of government and everything? I mean,
they're doing very little, but there are some things that are starting to change. They did, Facebook or Meta, for example, rolled out some functions where you can indicate if an image that's shared is a nude image of you, and you can, in principle, have it taken down. But there's a lot of cases where these systems don't work, and it's also, again, a very minimal effort, really, compared to how much then these images are just shared in private chats instead, because they often are.
Yeah. And what do you think it could be done to make this situation disappear, at least to make it better, if it can be better?
Yeah, because I don't think it's ever going to disappear, because no kind of sexual violence is, unfortunately. I think a way to make it better, of course, is to get a legislation where it's actually easier to prosecute, and a lot has been done for that already. Then, and some legislation existed already. People just didn't know it could be used that way. Then the next step that is also already happening is to have to make police more aware that these are crimes that they can actually be prosecuted, because very often victims early experienced that the police wouldn't know, so they would go to the police and they would talk about their case, and the police would say that, well, there's no ground for prosecution, we're not really sure if this is illegal. And I would say also today, most police people know that, but still probably not everyone. But these steps, they already help a lot. And then, of course, the really important part is prevention. And there's a lot of work done already in even making people aware of how serious these kind of assaults are, because that makes some people at least think twice. And then I think there's also a lot of work that could be done from social media in relation to regulating this kind of content, and making it easier to delete content. And that would benefit a lot of people in a lot of ways, that it would be more possible to have your content removed from social media.
So these are like the consequences that the abusers can face, right? Like, do they also need to pay a fine, maybe be in jail? What are the consequences?
Quite a few of them did get jail time. They usually, most of them didn't actually serve it, but they got jail sentences, and a lot of them also had to pay compensation for damages. So they are fined and sometimes also get jail time, especially if it's these child pornography cases. Okay. If it's not child pornography cases, usually they just get a fine.
Okay. Okay. Then what about the victims? So, because you focused more on what happens after the crisis, right? What are the long-term consequences and not only the short-term? What can you tell us about this?
Yes. So usually the kind of stories you hear about digital sexual assault are these very short-term consequences. So how, for example, it's a kind of assault that keeps repeating itself. So you have the images are shared and you realize it and it's really bad, and then maybe it goes away for a while and then it pops up again somewhere, it's reshared and you get more harassment. So the consequences are this immediate consequences are that victims are very often afraid all the time when being in public on social media, because they have this awareness that, oh, maybe it pops up again now and these people will start harassing me. Or when they're in public, they get this feeling of being looked at all the time because they don't know who have seen the images. It can be anyone, right? So everyone can kind of, that looks at them just a little bit weird, can feel like an aggressor. So that is obviously very intimidating.
And exhausting mentally.
And exhausting, yeah, and provokes a lot of anxiety and other very serious symptoms like post-traumatic stress, like symptoms for a lot of them. On a more long term, many of them learn to live with this exposure in different ways. So for some, it's important for them that the people around them know about the assault, because what they fear is often that if the images pop up, their colleagues or the people they study with or something will see them. So by telling people about the assault, they can reclaim the story and maybe frame the story in their own words, rather than having to always be afraid that people around them find out in some other way.
So people either kind of want to take charge of it and say what it was for them, then or they shut themselves more.
Yes, they can shut themselves down. I mean, for shorter periods of time. There are some of the women I talked to who had these stories of not wanting to go out at all and cutting all the social engagement, and that of course doesn't work long time. But then maybe they took other approaches. For example, some of them learned a lot about digital security, digital and privacy online, and they learned just a lot of things about how their data was shared and how to protect their data and be very safe with the way that they use media, and they found some alternative ways of, for example, being on Facebook. There was one of the women I talked to who used to disable her Facebook every night and then only enable it when she needed to use it, because then if your profile is disabled, then no one can find it. So it's basically invisible, but she could still use the media when she needed to. So they find a lot of different ways of also just making themselves less visible online, but while still being able to use the media in the way they want to.
And from these 5 girls that you followed, from what I understood, they are in different parts, right? Some of them is more recent, some are older situations, but are they eventually getting comfortable or more comfortable with this digital aspect of their lives? Because as you said, it's very hard to completely cut this out. At least this is not a permanent solution, right? So are they becoming more comfortable?
Yes, I would say they are becoming more comfortable. Some of them still get a lot of harassment, and they do learn to deal with that in different ways. And they start to feel less afraid and less ashamed, and maybe become more angry and use it to act. But also, as they grow older, they actually do face less harassment, and there's a lot of reasons for that, because maybe some of the people where the images are very old, well, they were just not that good quality images. So with new, better images, they're not interesting anymore. Or they grow so much older that they're not really recognizable anymore. So it's harder for people to find them just by, recognizing their face. So are a lot of ways that it becomes less frequent over time with this image sharing. And then some are more or less lucky. For some of them, their images ended up in databases that just seem to never disappear, because they're these online photos that are downloaded and uploaded again and downloaded and uploaded again. And for others, maybe the images were shared more locally among a few people. And then as these people lose interest, then maybe the image actually doesn't pop up again at some point.
Okay.
But they never know for sure, and that's of course also what they're scared for.
Yeah, exactly. And then a little bit more about the coverage of this. So is it good that is it being more covered or not? Because this can be triggering for some victims, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's important to talk about this subject.
Yes. They had very mixed feelings about that, the women I talked to, because quite a few of them experienced more harassment right after there had been a case in the media, because people got curious and then they go to find the pictures and then they also become reshared. So a lot of them hated when there was media attention because it made the harassment more intense for them. Mm-hmm. But they also all agreed that it was good that someone talked about it, because there also needs to be some kind of awareness, as you said. Mm-hmm. So I think there's no one answer to that. That's really just a double-sided thing.
Okay. And then for our last question, is there something very specifically that one can do to avoid these situations? Did you come up with this? Like, is it as simple as simply do not share anything?
No, I mean, of course, there are things you can do to make it a little bit less likely, but no, there's nothing you can do to avoid it. Some of the cases I work with were even, pictures that were edited, where someone took a Facebook profile picture and put it in a porn movie by using some kind of editing tool. And there's really no way you can... And a lot of the cases also involved images that were taken where people didn't know. It can be photographed through a window or in a changing room, or one case involved partner violence, domestic violence, and that's also not really something you can do anything to protect yourself from. So these kind of digital sexual assault, they are involved in so many other spheres that really there is nothing you can do, unfortunately. But one of the things you can do is that if this is starting to happen, if there are images that get out of control, you need to tell people very, very quickly, because there are a lot of the kind of abuse, not all of them, but a lot of them that are based on sextortion and different kind of trying to extort the victims for more images, shaming them. Yeah, and as soon as you share your story, that becomes less interesting. So really the best thing is to be very open about it and then go to the police.
Okay. Is there anything else you would like to share on the topic?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, perfect. And thank you so much for coming, Sina.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for staying with us. We see you next time.
Vidste du, at de fleste ulykker i kryds kunne undgås, hvis vi bruger bare 2 sekunder mere på at orientere os? Men hvad skal der til, for at vi husker det? Skal vi se en ulykke? Skal vi se blod? Eller skal vi bare se det på de sociale medier?
Er du der? Er du der? Kom, hallo?
Skal vi skrue op for dramaet? Måske vi skal bruge en
dyb og sexet stemme.
Eller skal vi vise død? Skal vi bruge humor?
Skal man bruge 2 sekunder, hvis man er på en 1-hjulet cykel?
Eller se, hvordan det påvirker familien? Vi kan også bare vise, hvordan det kan ende. Så hvad skal der til, for at du orienterer dig 2 sekunder mere i krydset?